We're here today to talk about the journalists Phillip Knightley and John Pilger, who were two of the most acclaimed journalists of the last 50 years. Both had very close connections with the University of Lincoln. John Pilger was awarded an honorary degree here, an honorary doctorate, while Phillip Knightley was a visiting professor here for a number of years. John Pilger also helped to launch the School of Journalism in 2004, and a plaque bearing his name still resides in the on the first floor corridor just outside of Newsroom 1. Professor Richard Keeble is a former head of the Lincoln School of Journalism and also an honorary professor at Liverpool Hope University. He's written and edited 50 books on a wide range of media-related subjects, including literary journalism, practical newspaper reporting, communication ethics, George Orwell, peace journalism, the coverage of US and UK militarism and the secret state, investigative journalism, the Hackgate controversy, and digital journalism. So with his lecture on why journalism matters on John Pilger and Phillip Knightley, please welcome Professor Richard Keeble.
Right, thank you for that, John. A special welcome to my friends who've come all the way from Lincolnshire, Louth and District. Also my former colleagues, it's lovely to see you all. A special thank you to my former student Hussein, who's come all the way from London again and will be filming it, and for Oliver, who's filming it for the students. So hopefully this will go on the website and the world will be able to follow this. Right, should last about 40 minutes. Questions and complaints afterwards. Right, as John rightly pointed out, Pilger and Knightley were two of the most acclaimed journalists of the last 50 years. Both were Australians who had very close connections with this university, which I'm going to spell out later in my talk. Neither Pilger nor Knightley studied at any university, but both were highly intelligent, confident in handling complex ideas and data. The originality and depth of research involved in their various books were extraordinary. In this talk, I want to highlight the strengths of their journalism for both the corporate and alternative media, their many brave, award-winning investigations, and the moral and political urgency that drove so much of their reporting. Their careers, above all, are proof that the best journalism does matter. So, an overview. For Pilger, I will stress how his journalism was inspired by a commitment to the poor, how he loathed parachute journalism. That's when journalists arrive, say, in a place, a country which has suddenly appeared in the news, they'll cover it for maybe a week and then leave and never go back. It's called parachute journalism. How his journalism exposed wrongdoing and abuse of power. And then on a personal note, how I got on with Pilger. For Knightley, he always joked about how he looked like Vladimir Lenin, which is true, he did, it looked very much like that. His humour, his critical reflections on reporting, his myth-busting, again on a personal note, what we did together, and I'll end with a few conclusions. So, moving through the next one, yeah. John Pilger's reporting over many decades was inspired by a deep commitment to the poor, to the victims of Western imperialist aggression, and to those marginalised by oppressive colonial powers. For Pilger, who died in December 2023, aged 84, his journalism was a form of political activism, which took in newspaper reporting for the tabloid, quality and alternative press, feature writing, broadcasting, investigative work, foreign corresponding, war reporting, and blogging at johnpilger.com. He was the first to win the UK's Journalist of the Year award twice, in 67 and 79. Other accolades included International Reporter of the Year, 1970, Campaigning Journalist of the Year, 1978, Sydney Peace Prize, 2009, and the Grierson Trust Award in 2011. George Orwell once said that he set out to make political writing an art. In a similar way, Pilger's writing is distinctive in its literary elegance, but also in its vitality, its subtle use of irony, its often clever blend of rhetoric, historical analysis, personal memoir, and political insight. Its descriptive power and its command of often complex and highly sensitive documentary evidence. It never drifts into dry, abstract, ideological theory. My PhD student, Florian Zollman, now head of teaching and learning in journalism at Newcastle University, interviewed Pilger about his Daily Mirror Youth in Action series in 1966 for a book I edited on literary journalism. Pilger commented, great quote this, "At an early age, I was influenced by the style of journalism that seemed unusually rigorous, which became almost a way of seeing. It elevated the active voice over the passive voice. It denied cliches and employed adjectives only sparingly. It spoke directly but unpatronizingly to the reader. I remember how one particular passage in Youth in Action took me about 2 days to write. I was determined that it should say exactly what I wanted it to say, but also with a certain rhythm. By giving priority to the writing, I have tried, not always successfully, to draw together the literary, the analytical, and the historical. This is true of my films, as well as my written works." His early influences, he told Zollman, were the American realist writer like John Steinbeck, the great descriptive journalist James Cameron, and the Australian novelist Patrick White, whose epic fiction seemed so fine in its human description. For Pilger, journalists had to strive to be ethical, accurate, and to seek the truth. But claims about professional objectivity, he felt, should be treated skeptically. Rather, he drew on Noam Chomsky's propaganda model. There you go. Hussein was remembering how my colleague here, Ola, introduced Hussein all those years ago to Chomsky's propaganda model. Here it is. Chomsky's propaganda model to highlight the ways in which the corporate media too often serve as propagandists for the dominant political, economic, cultural, military and intelligence interests. In 1991, the Oxford English Dictionary of New Words included the verb to pilger, defined as to conduct journalism in a manner supposedly characteristic of Australian author and journalist John Pilger. The term had been coined by the right-wing journalist Auburn Wall to mean when anybody who wants to make a good argument shouts and waves his arms about a lot and, vaguely blames you for murdering Vietnamese babies. In response, Phillip Knightley provided a new definition of to Pilger, namely to regard with insight, compassion and sympathy. Right. Pilger loathed parachute journalists who dropped into an area of sudden interest to the mainstream media, quickly filed their superficial reports, and then forgot about it. In contrast, he practiced immersive journalism, returning again and again to his sources, the miners, the Aborigines, the Palestinians suffering under Israeli oppression, the Chagos Islanders expelled by the UK and US to Mauritius between 1967 and 73 to make way for a massive military base, the people of East Timor. In his dissections of the media, he focused as much on what was missing, in other words, on that which was often held secret, as on the actual content. As he commented, secretive power loathes journalists who do their job, who push back screams, peer behind facades, lift rocks. Opprobrium from on high is their badge of honour. Significantly, Pilger titled his History of Australia A Secret Country. His television documentary about the media's coverage of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and of Israel's oppression of Palestine is called The War You Don't See. While Hidden Agendas in 1998 collects his writings on Tony Blair's New Britain, Burma, South Africa and Vietnam. His 11 books offer a highly personal and critical overview of the practice of journalism, the giants of investigative reporting, and the histories of the Aborigines and Australians, of British colonialism, and of US-UK militarism. I found them indispensable in my teaching of journalism to university students over the years. The first, The Last Day of 1975, is an account in forensic detail of the last hours of US presence in Vietnam. Heroes of 1986 begins with a revealing memoir of his first journalist assignments for a local Sydney newspaper, and moves on to bring together his reports for the Daily Mirror and British television from the 1960s to the 1980s. Over this period, he covered many of the key events in the United States. He was standing close to Robert Kennedy when he was assassinated in June 1968, and the UK, such as the miners' strike of 1984 to 1984. As well as in Palestine, Vietnam, Cambodia, Eritrea, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. When reporting on the activities of dissidents in Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, he often went undercover. He was a brilliant interviewer, able to expose, for instance, the ruthless lawlessness of the CIA in his insistent questioning of the former CIA Latin American chief, Dwayne Claridge, in this 2015 clip.
Dwayne Claridge was head of the CIA's Latin American division in the early 1980s.
Chile only reason it exists is because of Pinochet.
At a huge human price.
Human price, give me a break.
The thousands who were disappeared and murdered.
Thousands, you count them. What thousands?
Well,
We have truth commissions.
I've seen their names in the cemetery in Santiago.
Yeah,
You're saying
there
their
are
faces.
thousands, there are thousands.
Well,
There are thousands, sir.
it was a period in which almost everybody in the present situation regards as a dark time, in which the CIA played a major role.
That's right. They played a major role in overthrowing, what's his name?
What's his name? Salvador Allende.
Yeah, fine.
He was democratically elected.
Right, okay.
Is that okay to overthrow a democratically elected government? Is that okay?
It depends on what your national security interests are.
I can deny that Pinochet caused huge suffering.
I don't buy it. That he committed crimes, I agree.
But it's worth it.
Huh?
Is that what you're saying? Those crimes are worth it?
Yeah. Sometimes, and unfortunately, things have to be changed in a rather ugly way.
According to the Truth Commission and a whole swathe of human
Oh, come on,
lives.
John, this is where we're going. You're wasting my time.
Well,
That's all bullshit. Those people all had agendas.
so it's bullshit that the Salvadorian military were murdering tens of thousands of people.
I bet you can't count more than 200 in the whole 10 or 12 years. You're taking the stuff from these propaganda mills. And I'm not interested.
What are the propaganda?
All these things, this truth thing and all that, they're nothing but propaganda mills.
You really think
I
that?
didn't know so.
And are they all communists, liars, Amnesty International?
Amnesty International's right in the middle.
Have you, when I mean you, the CIA, the United States government, or any foreign power, what right do you have to do what you do in other countries? What
National
right?
security interest.
But that's a divine right, isn't it? Because the people that you do it to have no say.
Well, that's just fine.
Right.
We are gonna protect ourselves, and we're gonna go on protecting ourselves, because we end up protecting all of you. And let's not forget that. We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, well, get used to it, Laurel. We're not gonna put up with nonsense. And if our interests are threatened, we're gonna do it.
I think it was worth coming just to see that. And if there were students around, you could spend an hour just deconstructing that and what they could learn from Pilger's cool in the face of that man, and how in command of the subject he was, that he could engage in that kind of dialogue and expose the CIA for what they are. A masterful piece of interviewing, I think, and that was just typical of the man. Right. So, Tell Me No Lies highlights the kind of investigative writing Pilger most admired, by his friend Martha Gellhorn, Jessica Mitford, James Cameron, Seymour Hersh, Edward Said, Linda Melvin, Gunter Walrath, and Amira Huss, amongst others, which exposed wrongdoing, injustice, and the abuse of power. The brave dispatches sent by his fellow Australian, Wilfred Burchett, following the American bombing of Hiroshima in August 1945, that revealed to the world the truth about post-nuclear radiation sickness, are typical. In his last book, Freedom Next Time, which collected his latest reporting on South Africa, Palestine, Afghanistan, and the Chagos Islands, he is almost alone in daring to challenge the almost saintly image of Nelson Mandela. As Mark Curtis, author and editor of Declassified UK, commented, the array of interviews with the voiceless and abused provides an indispensable corrective to the litany of disinformation we are fed by the media. Many of his 60-plus films, 20 of them in collaboration with David Munro, tackle topics largely ignored by mainstream print and broadcast outlets. His first, The Quiet Mutiny, for ITV's World in Action in 1970, dares to document the collapse of morale amongst American soldiers in Vietnam. It features many outspoken interviews with disgruntled grunts who even admit to killing unpopular officers. From the late 1970s, in his campaigning journalism in the Daily Mirror and in his television documentary Cambodia Year Zero, he exposed the full horrors of the Cambodian killing fields, so helping to launch a global humanitarian response. The Dirty War on the NHS, his last film, highlights the ideological attacks on the health service, both before and throughout the COVID-19 crisis, with inept private firms given lucrative contracts for protective equipment and mass testing. Towards the end of his life, Pilger devoted a great deal of his time to speaking out and writing in progressive, alternative media outlets in support of his friend and fellow Australian Julian Assange, the founder of the whistleblowing site WikiLeaks, who was held in Belmarsh prison fighting extradition to the US on charges related to the publication of thousands of classified documents in 2010 and 2011. Sadly, Pilger died in December 2023, so not witnessing Assange's release from prison in June 2024. How overjoyed he would have been. So, this is my contacts with Pilger. As a teenager, Pilger's outspoken campaigning journalism in the Daily Mirror helped inspire me, as I'm sure many others, to become a journalist. My own professional collaborations with Pilger began when he gave regular talks to my journalism students at City University London in the 80s and 90s. For The Newspaper's Handbook of 1994, he gave a wonderful back cover endorsement, which I'm sure helped make it a success. It is now in its 5th edition. When I moved to the University of Lincoln in 2003, he was closely involved in the launch of the School of Journalism, and he was awarded an honorary doctorate in 2008. His annual talks for the Journalists Speak Out series up to 2013 would always be packed out. He donated £200 for a prize to the best student in the Investigative Journalism BA, the only such undergraduate programme in the country, while his archive, currently held at the British Library, was digitalised by Florin Zollman, a PhD student here. When Zollman, the late John Tulloch, Professor of Journalism at Lincoln, and I edited a collection of essays on the theme of peace journalism to accompany the launch of the Human Rights Reporting Master's degree in 2010, Pilger wrote the foreword. Peace journalism, he said, challenges journalism's right to occupy the mainstream, suggesting that those who propagate the profanities of war no matter their euphemisms, ought to occupy the craft and humanities margins until they are finally made redundant. See the power of his writing, the rhythm of it. Okay, on to Philip. Hack all the wit and super sleuth. Right, how am I doing? Okay. Born in Sydney, Phillip Knightley begins his career in 1946 as a copyboy with the Sydney Daily Telegraph. He becomes a Freemason, interesting, and works for a range of titles in Australia, Fiji, and England. Then in 1954, he is appointed managing editor of the Bombay literary magazine Imprint. Much later, he learns that it is being funded by the CIA. Returning to the UK, in 1963, he becomes a special correspondent for the Sunday Times, remaining there until 1985, establishing himself as a leading member of its celebrated Insight investigative team. In 1975, his seminal history of war reporting, The First Casualty, is published. After leaving the Sunday Times, he contributes literary criticism to a range of international titles, lectures on journalism, law and war at universities in the UK, US and Germany. One of his major interests over the next 30 years is spying, and his history of espionage, the second oldest profession, great title, is published in 1986. He meets most of the spy chiefs of all the major intelligence services in the world and interviews numerous officers and agents from all sides during the Cold War and afterwards. He is European representative on the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and he's made a member of the Order of Australia in the Queen's Birthday Honours in June 2005. Quotes for services to journalism and as an author. Knightley, who died in 2016, aged 87, and Pilger have much in common. But John Pilger, the radical left dissident who never voted in any election, would never in a million years have accepted an honour from the Queen. So, what is interesting is Philip, when he wrote, was hilarious. But when you met him, he was quite serious. Pilger was the opposite. He wrote always very seriously. It was very amusing when you met him. Interesting. Right, his A Hack's Progress, Knightley, stands alongside the memoirs of journalists Wilfred Burchard, Claude Coburn, James Cameron and Martha Gellhorn. It's one of the greats. I wish students were here. I would have sold them too. I recommend it to everyone here tonight. Not only does it tell his life story, but he reflects critically on a lot of journalistic routines, and it's laugh out loud, very, very funny. Let me take just a few examples. He's working on the police beat for the Sydney Herald, and he gets a call from a restaurant where the chef has just beaten off an armed robber. So he invents a story about the chef of a Hungarian restaurant fooling an armed robber by chucking a plate of Hungarian goulash in his face. One of the trainees on the paper tells the editor, Lionel Hogg, "But Lionel, that wasn't true." Hogg laughed. "No," he said, "but it should have been." Philip adds, Hogg had a point. And over the years, I've come across countless newspaper stories in which the facts fit together so neatly that I suspect the reporters would have all been taught by Hogg. When later reporting for The Truth, journal in Sydney, it's a quiet Friday. So the editor tells him to go away and invent a story. So he comes up with this yarn. Okay. A man is terrorising women on the buses by lifting up their skirts with a clothes hanger hook. The editor loves the story. And the story headline, Hook, Sex Pervert, Strikes Again, is page 1 lead. Philip is worried. How will the cops react? The weekend passes. Then Monday, then Tuesday. Oh golly, Wednesday, the phone rings. It must be the cops raising serious questions about his story. Is that you, Knightley? Asks the cop, nervously. Philip answers, yes. Well, the cop goes on, that Hookman story you wrote, well, we've caught the bastard. Good old Philip. Why did he tell that story? You don't know if it's true or whether he's invented it. What he's saying is, don't believe me, don't believe anything. Be sceptical. Of the Royal Press Corps he meets while reporting for the Sydney Mirror, he writes, a lot of the men were either half drunk all of the time or fully drunk half the time. The Sunday Times, he says, prided itself on having big ideas, sweeping concepts, a dramatic overview of life. It did not go in for objective journalism, what one editor called all that on the one hand, but on the other hand, crap. Okay, more serious reflections on reporting. Among his reflections on reporting is this one on checkbook journalism. There is nothing wrong with it. You just have to be discriminating about who you are paying for. A lot of important investigations would be impossible without paying sources. He writes, information is a valuable commodity. Many people who have that information realise its worth and want to be paid for it. You could spend an hour debating that with students. One of his major scoops for the Sunday Times Insights column, led by the legendary editor Harold Evans, culminated 20 years of patient corresponding with Kim Philby, the infamous Soviet spy, who almost made it to the top of British intelligence before fleeing to Moscow in 1963. The Insights team began working on the Philby story in 1967, based on confidential interviews with members of the CIA, FBI, and British intelligence. He writes, so each week, when we published our latest revelations, we felt we were striking a blow for freedom of information, the right of people to know what those who govern them had been up to. Years later, Philip learned how different the truth was. British intelligence knew beforehand everything they were to publish each week. The editor-in-chief of the Sunday Times, Dennis Hamilton, was revealing all to them. Finally, in 1988, he interviewed Philby for 6 days at his comfortable apartment and in a private room in his favourite restaurant in Moscow. Philby made one condition, that a loaded gun be on the table in front of them as they spoke. Philip was involved in the celebrated Insights campaign for compensation on behalf of the children who suffered such terrible deformities as a result of their mothers taking the thalidomide drug. But for Philip, the story is much about the failures of journalism as its triumphs. In the end, the drug company distillers handed over 32 million. In 1996, the Guinness Trust, which had taken over distillers, gave another £37.5 million, while the government added a further 7 million. But for many of the children, while the money brought physical comfort, it did not bring happiness. Disturbing stories of greed and envy began to emerge. A limbless boy was even attacked after he received compensation. William McBride, the Australian doctor who first alerted the world to the dangers of the drug, was also to be attacked professionally by envious colleagues. So, Philip the myth buster. Philip loved busting myths. For much of his career, he wrote about spies and the intelligence agency, but he was never seduced, like so many other hacks, into becoming one of them. As he writes in the second oldest profession, the CIA, the FBI, the DIA, the NSA, KGB, SIS, GCHQ, ASIO, MI5, Stasi and DGSE, the whole bunch of acronyms and numbers, were all equally ineffective spy catchers as well as spies. MI5, Britain's so-called crack counter-espionage service, never caught a single spy on its own during the whole 50 years of the Cold War. Right. One of the biggest myths Philip helped bust surrounded the nearly saintly figure of Lawrence of Arabia, who died following a motorcycle accident in May 1936. Lawrence acquired enormous fame for championing Arab independence in the bloody desert fighting against the Turks during the Great War. The Sunday Times, which originally approached in the late 1960s by Scotsman John Bruce, who claimed he had joined the Tank Corps with Lawrence of Arabia, had become close friends with him, and then had been engaged by Lawrence to beat him from time to time with a birch. Then came the crucial breakthrough. Lawrence's surviving brother, Professor A.W. Lawrence, was persuaded to allow Knightley and his Sunday Times colleague, Colin Simpson, access to Lawrence's archive of letters being held incommunicado until 2000 in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So all was revealed. And Bruce was found to be telling the truth. The first article appeared on the 9th of June 1968 and caused a sensation. And not surprisingly, lucrative book deals with American and British publishers followed. Working on these, a new picture of Lawrence emerged. Far from having an emotional attachment to the Arabs, he did not care for them as a race, and he believed it was in Britain's interest to keep the Middle East divided. Far from furthering the cause of Arab independence, he was intent on making the Arabs part of the British Empire. As Philip writes in Hack's Progress, the double dealing and betrayal this involved left Lawrence with a lasting sense of guilt. which explained much of his behaviour later in life. Significantly, Philip's seminal history of war reporting, The First Casualty, is subtitled The War Correspondent as Hero and Mythmaker, from Crimea to Kosovo. In a foreword, John Pilger describes it as a clear-sighted and principled book that throws down a challenge to journalists to examine their role in the promotion of war in propaganda and its myths. Right. I got to know Philip well when I was teaching at City University London from 1984 to 2003. I would invite him to lead sessions with my students on international reporting and investigative journalism. When my PhD was published by Luton University Press as Secret State Silent Press, New Militarism, the War and the Modern Image of Warfare, in 1997. Philip sat alongside me at the press conference the university kindly fixed to launch the book. And Philip references me quite considerably in his chapter in The First Casualty on the reporting of the 1991 Gulf conflict. In 1999, I organised what was to turn out a packed meeting in central London for journalists opposed to the appalling NATO attacks on Serbia. And both Philip and John Pilger spoke from the platform. After I moved to Lincoln in 2003, I made Philip a visiting professor, and he would come each year to give public lectures in my Journalists Speak Out series, often alongside John Pilger, and the lecture theatre would, not surprisingly, be packed. We shared an interest in journos and spies, so there was always something to gossip about. In his final years, he would direct most of his reporting at the alternative progressive Australian website, New Matilda. I would meet up with him in London at his favourite coffee shop regularly, and until shortly before his death. So, my conclusions. Moving on. There should be one more screen. Yeah. Right. The careers of Pilger and Knightley demonstrate so clearly how journalism, at its best, occupies a crucial place within both the dominant and alternative public spheres, can give voice to the voiceless, it can expose the lies of the warmongers, and it can debunk so many of the myths surrounding the supposed heroism of journos and politicians. By highlighting the ways in which the corporate media propagandize, essentially in the interests of the dominant military, industrial, political, and economic interests. It can expose the myth of the free press, it can educate, and it can inspire political action. As I was starting my career as a journo in Nottingham and Cambridge, Pilger and Knightley were my heroes. I was lucky to get to know them well later on as colleagues and friends. And just as they inspired me, I'm sure they did the same for many of my students. And they live on in their books, in their documentaries now accessible via the internet, and in their journalism now archived. Thank you.